US Embassy in Jerusalem. Well, today marks the 70th anniversary of what the Palestinians call Nakba, or catastrophe, which saw thousands flee during the creation of Israel in 1948. I'm joined now by Lyndon, European Director of the Alliance for Middle Eastern Peace. And John, we saw the juxtaposition of those images yesterday. They were jarring, weren't they? But actually, that is the reality of life for many people, both on the Gaza side and the Israeli side of that border all the time, isn't it? Although perhaps not in such great numbers.
Yeah, you're completely right. It was a very stark metaphor, I think, this sort of split-screen reality with celebrations in Jerusalem, whilst there was riots and firing on unarmed civilians in the Gaza Strip. And this is a striking visual representation of the reality in 2018, where Israelis and Palestinians have never been more polarised, and I'd argue they've never been more dehumanised, with neither side really understanding the reality that's lived. There's a huge striking gap between the reality that Israelis see and what Palestinians live every day, particularly in the Gaza Strip, where life has become almost unlivable over the last decade or so following closure.
When the Israelis pulled out of Gaza, there were such high hopes, weren't there, that the Strip would go back to what it once was, really, which was verdant and had a big farming community and was a lovely place to live at one time. Why has that not happened?
Well, they've been let down by their leaders, by Israeli and Palestinian leaders, by us in the international community, I think, as well. And we've basically allowed 10 years to pass without any meaningful efforts to provide long-term solutions. And that's really our failure in this space. It's trying to think long-term. Some of the worst actors in Israel-Palestine are taking 20, 30-year time horizons, building the reality that we now inhabit, whereas the more sort of sensible actors tend to look for short-term fixes to problems that are metastasizing now over time. And Gaza is the greatest symbol, I think, of that failure. Nikolai Mladenov, the UN Special Representative to the peace process, joined us at the Alliance for Middle East Peace's annual conference in Jerusalem back in March, 8 weeks ago, and he predicted what happened yesterday. He said we're going to have an outbreak of violence, the worst that we've seen since 2014, and he's a very smart man, but he's not a prophet. This was very, very much expected, and yet we all sat and watched week on week these protests increase, metastasize, and then obviously yesterday's horrific events transpired. And we have to look at ourselves internationally and say, what is our culpability in allowing this to happen? How are we failing, particularly the young people of Israel, Palestine, and particularly Gaza? The average age in Gaza is 16. So these are people who were born during the Second Intifada, who know nothing but closure and know very little other than rule by Hamas, by the Gaza Strip being completely sealed. And it's up to us internationally, I think, to take a more far-sighted approach and try and build a reality where Israelis and Palestinians can coexist and see each other as human beings, because amongst youth in particular, on both sides, we're seeing striking levels of hatred, dehumanization, rationalization of violence. If we let that persevere over time, it promises to make the conflict escalate rather than resolve, and we'll have to really examine our own actions to allow that reality to transpire.
But is that true, really, that the young are becoming dehumanised? I know it's a while since I've been there, but from the time that I spent out there, it was pretty clear that there were extremists within Israel and there were extremists within the Palestinian territories, and never twain should meet between either side. But below those extremists, there were, by and large, a percentage of the population who just wanted to live in peace. Some with a two-state solution, some not, but that didn't see their immediate neighbours as being dehumanised. What's changed in 10 years?
Over the last 10 years, even longer, we've had closure between Israel and the Palestinian territories. So the reality you described is true and accurate, but now Israelis and Palestinians are seeing each other and mixing far less. Even in the media, you know, yesterday we saw the reality in Jerusalem being all over the airwaves in Israeli television, but very little of the background and context and events in Gaza were being screened. So even technology and TV aren't transcending that divide. And you now have youth attitudes on both sides that reject a two-state solution to a far greater degree than their parents' generation, and also justify the use of violence. We have 67% of Palestinians in 2016 who justified stabbing attacks, 72% who thought an armed intifada was more effective than diplomacy. And on the Israeli side, only 28% of people amongst the youth are willing to reject price tag violence against Palestinian civilians. This is why we need to take a very scaled approach to facilitate interactions between Israelis and Palestinians that can change that reality. And in that respect, we're delighted at the Alliance for Middle East Peace that Middle East Minister Alistair Burt has come out and endorsed an international fund for Israeli-Palestinian peace that can really scale peace building and change the reality profoundly on the ground.
But in terms of those talks, I mean, you look at what Tony Blair tried to achieve after he left power here. Millions and millions, billions of pounds have been put into trying to get a peace in the Middle East between these two sides almost since 1948, for the last 70 years, and it's not succeeded. We've come close sometimes and sometimes we haven't. Who's to say that President Trump's decision to move the Israeli embassy, to change the facts on the ground, he did it on a day where he knew there'd be protests anyway. Who's to say that changing the rules might be the impetus that is needed to something has to change, doesn't it? And the old ways of putting in money and having talks haven't worked.
Well, I take issue with the premise because we've spent 5% of the amount of money we spent in Northern Ireland on peace building, where a fund was set up 12 years before a peace deal to shape a constituency for peace. We spent 5% of that sum in Israel-Palestine on a population 15 times the size of Ulster. But on your point regarding President Trump, what he's done is disrupted a situation. The status quo certainly needed to be disrupted, but he's disrupted it in an alarming way that's resulted in the loss of life, and we need to be very clear about that. And I think taking a final status issue and predetermining the United States' position on it, that's certainly how Palestinians have perceived it, has made diplomacy harder to achieve. It's made the prospect of real negotiations towards two states seem very remote. And I think that needs to focus us internationally, rather than trying to drive both parties into a room in a process that we understand is flawed, where the President of Palestine and the Prime Minister of Israel seem so far apart. Let's try and take a more serious, significant and long-term approach to building a constituency that's first of all resilient to violence, because that's not what we have right now. We have people on both sides celebrating violence, but is also willing to have the sort of trust and political horizon that can allow diplomacy to function, because the more often we go back and repeat failed diplomatic initiatives without creating that foundation and groundwork, the more we're going to sap support for two states on the ground. And we're seeing that in very real terms with the attitudes of Israelis and Palestinians.
John Lyndon, the European Director of the Alliance for Middle East Peace, thanks very much.
Thank you.
This is Sky News coming up.